All right. So this morning we are going to be starting a new sermon series, and it is going to be on the Prodigal Son. And so, in lieu of that, I think it only appropriate that we look at the scripture from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 31, if you want to follow along in your pew Bible. And I invite you again to just kind of open your hearts and minds and just soak in this story. It should be familiar for many of us, but there's just a level of depth and powerful meaning that I think is available for each and every one of us. And so let us just encounter the text this morning. So Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me a share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out as a citizen out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast to celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is now found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he was back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours.'" Now, friends, as you can see, our sanctuary is decorated a little bit slightly with some different things. One of them happens to be the painting that we have down here. And Marianne, I'm going to have you move the slide forward. This is a painting by the famous artist Rembrandt, and it's called "The Return of the Prodigal Son." And one of the things that I want us to do as sort of an opening reflection is to spend some time just taking in this piece of art. See what it evokes for you personally. See what things stick out for you the most. And again, I'm going to ask us to just do this in silence, so no need to send out verbal answers. All right, so Michelle, I'm going to move if you need to move the camera here, but I'm going to come down. I mean, this painting should be pretty self-explanatory, but just in case you do have trouble making some of it out, I just want to draw your attention to the main characters. So again, we have the father. The younger son here is on his knees. The older son is standing erect here on the right side of the picture, and there are 3 sort of observers, a man here, a woman here, and another woman way up here, which you probably can't see on either picture. So I hope that just helps you identify the main characters within the painting itself. Now, again, as we begin this series, we're going to spend a lot of time in reflection, and this series is going to be more contemplative than we might be used to. And so for those of us that are introverts, we're like, yes, we kind of get this. We kind of get to go into ourselves and do some self-reflection. For those of you that are extroverts, you're like, oh, really? I don't really care to spend a whole bunch of time thinking about things. But nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to stretch yourself a little bit through this series because, again, as we deal both with art and with the parable, we find that there's very deep meaning that we can often miss if we just rush through saying, you know what, just tell me what I need. I want 3 points, and that's all I'm going to take away from it. Because there are levels of meaning within both the painting and within this story that we're going to go into. So let me provide a little bit of context for both of these, and I'm going to start with the nature of the parable itself, okay? And so Jesus often spoke in parables, and we understand parables to be short stories, okay? And these short stories are meant to sort of prick the hearer's heart, saying, look, there's something that you're doing that's not correct. It's meant to be sort of a convicting story for some people. And for other people, it can be a very comforting story for you, depending on how you fit into or you understand the parable, how you relate to it, all right? And again, these parables are meant to elicit a response from the people that hear them. Again, we're not just having Jesus or myself lecture at you and go, okay, I'm going to write down all of these notes and take in all of this knowledge. But rather, my hope is that as we go through this series and as you engage with the text and the painting, that it actually evokes some emotion, some feeling out of you that causes you to consider and perhaps even make changes within your life. All right? Now, as we move back to the painting, as I said, this was done by Rembrandt, and we believe that it was done roughly around 1668. And the pictures we have here are quite small in comparison to the actual size of this painting. And so if you were to go to the museum and see this painting is actually over 8.5 feet tall and almost 7 feet wide. Okay, and so it is oil on canvas. And again, Rembrandt is one of the masters of this 17th century Dutch period. All right, the painting itself is now part of a collection in the Hermitage Museum, which is in Russia. So unfortunately, I don't think there's many of us that are going to just book tickets to go see this right away. But, you know, one day, hopefully things calm down, and if you would love to see it, I know that this painting has been deeply meaningful for people across the centuries. And then finally, if you're a history buff, you might like to know that this piece was acquired by Catherine the Great of Russia, and she then, her collection was then taken in by the museum. All right, so as we go through, let's take a look at sort of the historical and cultural context of the people that would be hearing this from Jesus' mouth and consider how they look at the story, because I expect that it's much different. Their understanding of hearing this story is much different than we would, or the meaning we would take away from it in our modern understanding. You want to move me ahead one slide, please? All right. So it says in verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them." All right. So again, from a very textual scriptural or textual context, Jesus is here talking to a group of Pharisees and religious leaders. And if you go back to the beginning of chapter 15, you'll find that, once again, the Pharisees are unhappy that Jesus is spending time eating or even in the presence of tax collectors and sinners. And so what Jesus does here is he kind of does this switch to say, look, folks, I'm doing all this teaching. You're not happy with it. So listen to this story and tell me what you think about this. And so he goes on and he starts telling a bunch of parables about the lost. All right. And what Jesus is really doing here is saying, look, you guys are the religious leaders, and excuse me, and yet your view towards these people that are lost is one of exclusion. And yet the divine perspective on this, the perspective of my Father in heaven, is that we should celebrate when the lost are found, and we should welcome them back with open arms, and we should treat them just as we would a friend or a family member. And can you do that? And so again, we think about that pricking of the heart. These stories are often meant to convict the people that they are talking about. Now, from a cultural perspective, let's look at that, the beginning of verse 12. And it says, so the younger one said to his father, give me my share of the estate. All right. Now, friends, most Jews, or people of the Middle East for that matter, would find this request radically offensive. All right, it would be almost impossible to think of a son asking for his inheritance before the father had passed. All right, I'm pretty sure even in today's context, for those of us that have kids, most of us would not be real thrilled if our son or daughter came and said, hey, folks, you know what? I just want you to give half of your stuff to me right now. All right, most of us are kind of like, okay. But again, for people within this ancient Middle Eastern context, this was strictly taboo. And in fact, if there have been scholars that have gone throughout the Middle East asking this, and people say, look, this type of a request is impossible. It would never happen. And if it did, the response would be that the father would probably physically beat the son because he had no right to ask for his inheritance before the father had passed on. All right? Now, additionally, part of the understanding of inheritance was that even if the father did offer inheritance, that the father was still able to collect on some of the interest, if you would, or to live off of some of the proceeds of that inheritance. But the son, too, is saying, look, I basically want my stuff. I want you dead, is basically what this request amounts to. And so that's why it's radically offensive to this Middle Eastern group as they hear this. And they say that should never happen. So already you talk about an opening statement. I'm pretty sure Jesus has the Pharisees' attention. Now, we think that that's pretty radically offensive, but I think the next part is even more so, because guess what the father does? He actually divides his property and gives it to him. All right. Now, again, that's probably an even bigger thing for the people that are hearing this going, he did what? Are you serious? He's willingly going to give this son this request that should never have been made in the first place, and he's just going to let him go? And so again, folks, the understanding here has a much deeper meaning, I think, both for ourselves as well as for the historical people that are hearing this. So let's go to the next slide, if you will. Oops. Move me back. Move me back. All right. So now again here, we deal with the actual departure of the younger son. And it says, not long after that, the younger son gathered together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country where he squandered his wealth in wild living. And so, friends, again, this is deeply disturbing because, again, it assumes that home wasn't good enough, right? That the fulfillment, all of the joy of life can be found in this distant country, in this foreign place, rather than in the home, rather than in the family or the community, all right? And so as we think about that, it's this breaking of something that is almost this sacred legacy, of something that's been handed down generation to generation to generation. And this younger son is basically saying, you know what, I don't care about any of that, and I'd prefer to go live with people who are almost the exact opposite from the way that I grew up. I'd rather spend time over here with them doing these things because they look so much more appealing than the way I grew up. Now, friends, before we go too much into the departure this morning, I want us to take a moment, and I want us to go and take a look at that painting again. So, Marianne, if you'll move us forward. I want you to take a couple moments and reflect on what this painting says about the nature of home. And if you guys want to share some of your understandings or some of your interpretations of the painting, I'm open to those. Okay. Okay. So for those of you that didn't hear that, the first one is sort of this willingness to let the person go, right? The other one is this feeling of unconditional love, all right? And I think that both of those are very appropriate answers to that. And so, again, one of the things that we see here, I think, that sticks out perhaps most is this tender, gracious hold that the Father places on this younger son, right? That it says, look, no matter what you've done, no matter where you've gone, I still love you, right? This unconditional response to it. This unconditional acceptance that says, you know what, I've loved you for who you were from the time that you were in your mother's womb to the time that you are now in this full act of rebellion. I have always loved you and accepted you, right? There's also, I think, a tender or a gracious stillness in this painting, right? They're not a lot of the characters are moving. There's just simply this still embrace, almost like this is a snapshot of this moment in time where the Father just embraces. There's this stillness, which I think, at least for me, evokes sort of this level of comfort and security, that home is a place of safety. It's a place where we don't need to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid of our true selves and who we truly are. Now, again, Rembrandt was also a master of light, and one of the things that is so beautiful about this is the way light shines down. And where is the light shining? Right on the Father, right? Right on the picture of the old Father, and the light sort of comes out of him almost. And so one of the things that I took away from this is that, again, when we're at home with God, when we're in the presence of God, guess what? There's a light within us. This light reflects off of us. And that light is not just a simple reflection, but it can also be a power. And friends, if you were with us on Ash Wednesday, we listened to kind of Paul's description of what ministry is like, and I asked you how many people wanted to kind of sign up for what Paul was offering, and I don't think many of us were, because it was like, I don't really want to sign up for beatings today. I don't really want to be poor. I don't really want to give up my life, right? And yet, friends, when we're at home, we're in the presence of God the Father, guess what? We can do each and every one of those things. When we're at home, we have nothing to fear. When we're at home, we can do the ministry that God has called us to do, and we can do it with great effect. You know what? When I'm at home with God and in God's presence, I can suffer persecution and not need revenge. When I'm home with God, because God has given to me freely, I can then give to others freely. And even if I'm killed, I can know that when I'm at home with God, that God's love is stronger than death itself. So, Marion, you want to move the next slide for me? And so one of the things I want you to consider today is that home is not just a physical reality, but it's also a spiritual reality, right? It's a centering place where we experience God's love for. It's a place that our deepest desires, our deepest longings are met, all right? It's also a place where we're given our identity. And I think Henry Nouwen does a great job in his book, and he actually has a book with the same title as the painting. It's called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And I would highly encourage you guys, if you can get a copy or get a read of this, to do that. Nguyen is kind of one of our contemporary treasures, and he's just completely authentic in the way that he reflects on the meaning of this painting and how he understands or how God has worked in his life through the different characters in this story, okay? And one of the things he talks about is this idea that just as God has called Jesus his beloved Son, that we're to remember that when we accept Christ, we too become children of God, and that same identity is given to us, that, look, you are my beloved child. I love you no matter what, no matter where you've gone. Now, also, friends, we need to, I think, spend some time looking at our departure, right? Because for some of us, we've quite literally departed from our homes, right? We've entered into sort of a state of rebellion that says, you know what? It's better over here than it is back home, right? And I have to admit, I've been part of that crew. You know, I went off to college, and all of the things that I was taught for those many years, the way I was raised, I threw a whole lot of them out the window so that I could go do what seemed to be a whole lot more fun over here. And yet, in the end, it wasn't all quite so fun. The consequences were by far much worse than had I stayed true to what I knew, right? Now, the other hand, perhaps the more subtle understanding of this is what happens when we leave our spiritual home, right? And how often do we do that? So, friends, Marianne, will you move the next slide for me? So one of the next things I want to talk about is what I kind of call this siren's call of the world, right? And if you're a mythology fan, you remember that poor Odysseus had to endure the siren's call, this beautiful enchanted maiden that no one could escape their song, and they were constantly drawn to them. And an encounter with these sirens led to their demise, right? And so, friends, I have to say, many of us always live our life as if the grass is greener on the other side until you find out it's not, right? It always seems so much better over there. Everybody's life seems so much easier than ours, you know? And friends, that's just simply not the truth. All right? And so I want you to take a moment and to do some reflection again, and I want you to think about, to whom do you belong? Do you belong to the world, or do you belong to God? Now I'm going to add a little bit of tension here for you. Now I want you to consider all of the activities of your day. And where do you spend most of your time? Where are your preoccupations through most of the day? Are you preoccupied with the things of God, or are you preoccupied with all of the things of the world? And friends, again, this can be a very difficult thing for us to deal with. And even as a pastor, I have to say that there are those days that, as much as I would like to say, you know, I really belong to God, when I look at it and examine my days, it's like, guess what? I spent a whole bunch of time over here. I was busy doing all of these other things, and I maybe spent a half an hour with God in the morning if I did my quiet time. The other 23 and a half was all about me and what I wanted to do. And so then we really need to consider to whose we are and what home we're living in. Now, friends, part of it, we might say, is not our fault, right? We're just a victim to the circumstances that we grow up in, because pretty much from the time we're born, we're fed messages about how to survive in this world, right? How do we gain acceptance? How do we be popular, successful, and powerful? Think about how many times as a parent, or even as you were a child, that you heard, you know what? You got to do well in school so that you can get a good job. Who are the friends that you're hanging out with? I don't know if you should hang out with those people, because they seem to be dragging you down. And if you hang out with these people whose last names are really important, you're probably going to do a whole lot better. What about your jobs? right? How many of us log in 40, 50, 60 hours a week to do something just so that we can feel successful or feel appreciated, only to find that when we retire or if something happens to us, they forget who we are within a few months' time? What about all the activities that we engage in? Think of how many things there are for us to do, right? And we sit here in church and we think about all of the things that draw people away from even coming to 1 hour of worship on a week. And some of those things are legitimate, don't get me wrong. There are simply things that prevent us to, whether we're sick or have illness or there's some challenge we have. But there are a number of things that compete for our attention on a daily basis. And we have to say, look, am I going to stay at home? Or am I going to go out? Am I going to follow this call in the world? And friends, I want to be very serious about this because many of these things are deep longings for us, right? We all have a desire to be accepted. We all have a desire to be loved. And the world shouts at us from the time we're little kids that I can provide this to you. I can provide you to this if you'll just do this, if you'll just do this, if you'll just do this. But what does the Heavenly Father say? Guess what, folks? You don't have to do anything to earn this. I give it to you freely. You have all that you need. You have all that you desire right here. You don't need to go out over there because everything you have is right here. And that, my friends, I think begs the next question of, if we know this in our heart of hearts, if we know that God gives us all of these things and we feel most at home in the presence of God, why do we leave? Because we all do it, myself included, time and time again. We all walk away, even if it's just for a little bit of time. We all wander from home. And I want to read to you just a small paragraph from Nguyen's work here. And he says the same thing. Yet over and over again I have left home. I have fled the hands of blessing and run off to faraway places, searching for love. This is the great tragedy of my life and of the lives of so many I meet on my journey. Somehow I have become deaf to the voice that calls me beloved, have left the only place where I can hear that voice and gone off desperately, hoping that I would find somewhere else where I could no longer find at home. At first, this sounds simply unbelievable. Why should I leave the place where all I need or hear can be heard? The more I think about this question, the more I realize that the true voice of love is a very soft and gentle voice, speaking to me in the most hidden places of my being. It's not a boisterous voice forcing itself on me and demanding attention. It's the voice of a nearly blind father who has cried much and died many deaths. It is a voice that can only be heard by those who allow themselves to be touched. And so, friends, let us think about that. Let us consider that in our lives this morning. Let us take stock and notice of what it is that prompts us to leave home. And just as Nguyen alluded to in that paragraph, again, we have a God who loves us so much that he's willing to let us go, even though he knows it's going to hurt us, and even though it's going to hurt him, he lets us go because he doesn't want to force his love on us. Rather, he wants us to accept that and accept him for who he is. He wants us to return that love out of choice to him, not because he demands us to. Friends, that's what unconditional love is. And so, friends, I want to leave you with a couple of action steps today. Go to the next one, Marianne. The first one is reflect on when and how you have been the younger son and what things have lured you away. Now, again, one of the things that I want, without giving too much away, but one of the things that Henry Nguyen has done, and one of the things that I've enjoyed doing over the years as I've read this parable, is to place yourself in each one of the main character's shoes. All right, and so this week we're dealing with the younger son. Later we'll deal with the older son and then the father. But think about how you have been the younger son, both physically in your life and perhaps spiritually as well. And then finally, friends, share your story with others this week, okay? Again, this is a great time for us to share those stories of how we've wandered away and how God has redeemed and repurposed those events. God can also use those stories, some of the things we're not very excited about, to say, you know what, I've done this in my life and I can relate to you. Because again, just as Jesus is encouraging the Pharisees to go out and see the people and to welcome back the lost, the church too needs to learn this lesson, because often we're really good at pointing fingers at people that have wandered away or have done things that we don't deem appropriate. And we're pretty good at wagging fingers, but we're not always good about bringing people back and saying, you know, welcome back. We love you. We're glad that you are back home. And so, friends, God can use this to share in ministry and touch the lives of other people. God bless you guys. At this time, I invite us to